Well, the Sisyphus analogy wouldn't truly be fulfilled if the boulder didn't roll right back down the hill, right? So, welcome back to the bottom of the hill once again. An insurmountable climb awaits us, and it's time to talk about my 30-plus hour journey to beat endgame content in a silly gacha game in the most painful way possible. This is how I beat Refraction Railway Line 3 with the worst teams possible. For those of you who play Limbus Company and know what Refraction Railway 3 entails, you may be asking some very reasonable questions, like do you need therapy? Or is this the result of developmental trauma? Or even just what the hell is wrong with you? And while the answer to all of those questions is yes, I think it's fair to quickly explain my reasoning for doing this challenge, since it seems so odd to do it again after the first one was so painful. Well, the reason is because I wanted to. Yes, it was obviously heavily requested, and a lot of eyes were on me this time. Since when I did Railway 2 with the worst team, which is a video you should definitely watch before this one, it was just a fun thing I decided to do on a whim. This time it was an expectation, and that definitely made me up the stakes this time around. But it's ultimately because I wanted to do this. But enough blathering about Chekhov's narrative devices, let's not waste your time. You're here to learn about and actually talk about what made up the worst team possible this time around, and then talk about the fights. For those unaware, / the majority of you who ignored my request to watch the Railway 2 video first, this was my team for the entirety of Railway 2's Worst Team Challenge, to use as a point of reference of sorts. Base Faust, Base Merceau, Sloshing Ishmael, Mariachi Sinclair, Zwei Rodian, Bia Lotus, and Chef Gregor. 7 IDs, and 29 fights, to combine into a truly tedious and awful experience, but making a follow-up to that challenge here in Railway 3 came with some tough team-building choices. You see, Railway 3 works very differently to Railway 2, and fun fact, almost every single mechanical change made from Railway 2 to Railway 3 made this challenge harder. Railway 3 has 10 fights total, which is far less than Railway 2, which is a downside, since it means less easy fights to gain resources on. It also has 13 total nodes, with 3 of those being rest points, where your team is fully healed and is able to be swapped out entirely. Ego, IDs, support IDs, whatever. This was not a thing in Railway 2, and also different was the team size, a downgrade from 7 IDs to 6. This meant that no matter what I did, my team had to be different going in. The transition from Mobius to Orange Road clock thing, god, its name is hard to remember, also removed team buffs, skill deck carryover, and enemy debuffs, making this a much more vanilla Limbus Company experience, and when you are using the worst team possible, not having gimmicks to try and bend to your favor sucks. So I had to make several choices before even attempting this challenge, most notable of all being, do I swap out my team to make the worst team for each segment, or just make one team that is bad for all of the railway? And also by team, did I mean all 12 sinners, since unique to Railway 3, continuing after your first team dies is a viable strategy, allowing me to effectively double my team size. And while that would have been well within my right, I quickly dismissed the idea. When I say this, I mean no disrespect to other challenge runners out there, but having a full team of 12 sinners, it makes a huge difference. And not allowing myself wiggle room by limiting myself to only 6 IDs felt more in line with the spirit of the challenge. So that is established. Only 6 IDs may be used, no continuing after death. The rules from the previous challenge also mostly applied. The worst team means running the worst supportive passives possible. And this time, I made it even worse. You see, during the Railway 2 challenge, I skimped out a little bit. This was my full team, and very knowledgeable players will recognize that one of the IDs not being fielded is not the worst ID for their support passive. And that's Heathcliff. I chose to run Endcliff on the bench since, well, his support passive does nothing, which is technically not having an effect on my team, and that is bad, but I did, very deliberately, mind you, ignore Sunshower Heathcliff since his support passive, Ragged Umbrella, makes the ally with the least SP lose 10 SP when hit by an attack, for a measly 1 blunt damage up next turn. This is probably one of the worst support passives in the entire game, and thank God it specifies once per turn, since this could otherwise corrode you in an instant, but 10 SP loss on a team that is bad and can't really clash is borderline devastating. So with this pretty key addition in mind, I eventually, very reluctantly, decided I was also going to make the worst team possible for each of the 3 segments in Railway 3, including Spiral of Contempt, to the best of my ability, because this posed an interesting challenge before the challenge even began. I had to semi-mathematically infer what IDs would be the worst possible for each segment by looking at the 3 fights within those segments, and specifically looking at the resistances the enemies had, the damage types they dealt, and also just other factors like how bad my own rolls were on those IDs, then tailor my team so that they would get categorically fucked over as much as possible to justify the challenge's namesake. So let me take you through my team building thought process relatively quickly for segment 1. Segment 1 has 3 fights, just like every other proper segment in the Railway. Starting with Whale of the Porous Hand Mermaids, then a wave of Whale of 1,000 Strands Mermaids into Devouring Siltcurrent, and then Drenched Gossypium. Now, in order to make a worse team for this segment, I immediately disregarded the Porous Hand Mermaids, since they were going to be a joke no matter what IDs I brought. Siltcurrent and Gossypium, though, were 2 fights I was pretty scared of, especially back-to-back, so of course I had to make them as difficult as possible. Siltcurrent is pretty unique in terms of damage type resistances, since it doesn't have one that it resists, or even endures. The only damage type that's even slightly effective against it is Pierce, where the fluorescence is weak to it, which, inconveniently enough, all of the mermaid type enemies are also Pierce weak, so perfect, as little Pierce as possible. The sin affinities that are bad against Siltcurrent are Gloom, Lust, and Gluttony, so having as many of those as possible is encouraged, as well as not having any Envy. Frankly though, it was all about Drenched Gossypium, as I was far more worried about this fight at a first glance due to it putting me on a timer. In fact, on my first Railway 3 run-through, I barely focused on the actual fight since I was just scared thinking about how I was going to beat it with the worst team possible. It doesn't help that Gossypium resists Blunt, is slash weak, and resists Lust to an absurd degree, as well as Gluttony. Now, Wrath and Pride are strong against it, which are pretty common sins on the majority of the truly bad IDs, but as soon as I read that it was Blunt resistant, my heart sank. Since I always had a vague template of my worst team in mind due to the Railway 2 challenge, yeah, I could easily manage to have a lot of Blunt attacks on my team this time too. Also important to note, Evade is really good in this Railway on the whole, but especially on Gossypium, so I would be limiting that as much as would be reasonable, but I still placed emphasis on the actual ID being bad, rather than just do they not have an Evade. So you get an idea of what I had to do, but there's something very important I still haven't told you yet, and this is not something that's just spoiled in the title. So, you see, I make the horrible daily mistake of reading my YouTube comments, and a lot of the criticism I saw from the Railway 2 video was that I was basically never in danger due to having Pursuance Merceau and Fluid Sac, even if it was a limited amount. Now look, I get it. You want challenges to be hard, and my conclusion to that video saying any team can do this Railway with X overpowered ego isn't really breaking news, and that is a fair criticism. So let's get rid of all of them. What's them in this context? Well, just all of the He and Vow ego were banned for this run. Straight up. Now, your mind might be running through all of the ego that eliminates, but let me just help you get an idea. The only Zayn and Teth level healing ego are on screen. Dawn's base ego, Gregor's base ego, by technicality, both of the Effervescent Corrosion ego, Soda Hong Lu, Impending Day, Lifetime Stu Sinclair, and Lantern Gregor. Now, out of those, question for the class, remind me, which ones have potential to heal the team and not just the one who is using it? And we all know a Hong Lu ID isn't gonna be on a worst possible team, so... oh god. That was basically my reaction. I cannot describe to you the utter dread the fear that overtook me once I committed to Zayn and Teth Ego only, and I realized my only two options for team healing both fought for the same slot, and then I also realized I had to use Lifetime Stew's Sinclair to actually complete this challenge. Oh, and before you ask about the whole Zayn and Teth Ego thing, I know we haven't talked about the actual team quite yet, but regret was never a consideration. It is banned, obviously. So, with all of that in mind, this was the team I decided on for segment 1 of Railway 3. First up was Base Faust, making a triumphant return as a blunt ID providing mediocre debuffs, and a Gluttony Pierce skill 3 that was going to be extremely resisted by both threats in this segment, and has a roll that's about equivalent to the percentage of people watching my content who are subscribed, which is to say, way too low. Base Merceau also made a reappearance, who is another blunt ID with the worst possible offense level on ID with -3, and an even worse speed range of 2 to 3. Oh yeah, did I mention Faust is slow as shit too? Yep, we're doing this again. Sloshing Ishmael, who surely needs no introduction, but she's another blunt ID with mediocre skills, and yes, I do use a support Slosh Mill. My own Slosh Mill is relegated to stay at uptime 1 until the universe implodes, so you will see her equipped with Order Blossom Star and Blind Obsession, but I never use those ego during the run. Our first new entrant is Vi Sinclair, who is another blunt ID, who has the worst skill 2 probably in all of Limbus Company. Seriously, his rolls are absolutely terrible. On top of having a pathetic 2 to 4 speed range, low coins, only half decent protection effects, and some truly awful ego. Branch of Knowledge and Lifetime Stew, two very key players in this railway, being as miserable as possible, and also begrudgingly to Lifetime Stew's credit, making it possible at all. Breaking up the pace a little bit, I know I talked about Lifetime Stew before as if it was the second coming of Satan, and let me just take a moment here to talk about Lifetime Stew and justify my concerns, since it really is a character in its own for this challenge. Well, more like a necessary villain I trust everyone will come to hate, just as I have. Now, if you are for some reason Lifetime Stew's biggest stan, I need you to sit down for a moment, as I will only be talking about this ego as a source of healing, as that was the only practical application it had during my run. For all of its faults, Lifetime Stew is at least a very unique ego in how it works, having 7 attack weight and being indiscriminate on awakening, meaning it can always hit your allies, and if it does hit an ally, it does 0 damage on hit. This has 2 different effects depending on if it hits heads or tails. The heads hit effect is the one I wanted every time, without exception. This would heal allies by 10% of the user's max HP, and since I was oh so lucky and blessed enough to be using Vi Sinclair, this was going to be going off of his 210 max HP at level 40, which, yes, like in the previous challenge, I am using maxed units, up to 4, level 40, across the board for fielded IDs. Now, last I checked, 10% of 210 is 21, so 21 healing to all allies this hits, which is respectable enough healing, but this also created a similar problem to what I had with Merceau in Railway 2, since Vi Sinclair could never heal himself. Further issues show up if you hit tails, since this inflicts 7 burn to all who are hit, including allies. While this does not deal any Lust Blunt damage, it does deal 7 burn damage. Then it gives 2 haste and Ego Resource Amp next turn. Look, these 2 effects are good. Speed is a problem for the IDs I've mentioned, and even for those I have yet to mention. And Ego Resource Amp is, neat, I guess. The problem is that when I'm trying to heal my team, not healing them at all, and instead just dealing 7 more damage to them, is a genuinely, bafflingly demoralizing act. The issues with this ego during this run are so numerous, I literally cannot talk about them all right here, since some of them are relevant for later segments. So I'll be having soup segments, patent pending, spread throughout these videos. Whenever something terrible about Soup Sinclair comes up, I'll be talking about it then, but for now I'll point out one of the more obvious shitty things. This ego cannot clash. And I don't just mean numbers-wise. I mean, it won't clash. You see, this ego targets the units with the least HP, which against abnormalities that have 1000 plus health, yeah, this will be targeting my teammates primarily for 95% of the fight. This means that even if its pathetic 10 roll could win a clash to potentially gain Sandy from clash wins, I couldn't. But I seriously need to stop talking about this ego for now. It'll come up an unhealthy amount as it is. So let's bring in the next worst ID, Zweirotian, who is another one returning from Railway 2, who is, and say it with me, another blunt ID. Now, I praised Zweirotian in Railway 2, since she was actually pretty damn good there. This will not be the case here, and she's one of the biggest misconceptions I have seen people ask me about, saying if she's too good for the challenge because she was good in Railway 2 and was my top damage dealer. Now, to dispel this statement, Poise Boost and Gloom Boosts were present in Railway 2, buffing her ramp time and her damage. These are not in Railway 3. This means I have to properly ramp up my shield, which could take a long time when Ego has to be used interspersed, and more importantly, this skill 3 is a dead skill most times and is Blunt Gloom, meaning it is pretty terrible against both bosses. And another thing you might be wondering is, why didn't I mention Rhymeshank being banned alongside Regret? I specifically banned it in Railway 2, so why not here? Well, that's for a few reasons. Firstly, if I get enough resources to use Rhymeshank, I am not going to stop myself. Is it a strong ego? Very much so. Does it break the whole worst ID gimmick like Regret does with Merceau? No, not even close. Regret changes Merceau as a character, Rhymeshank is just a strong ego. And secondly, well, let's first talk about the last ID on the team, which is BL Otis, who, while she does have some decent damage-type matchups, she is kind of a default inclusion, and don't let Blade Lady and Merceau gaslight you, this ID is ass. But with that said, what does BL Otis being on the team have to do with Rhymeshank? I mean, we actually have a lot of Gloom across the board, that's the majority of its cost, so, oh. Yeah. You will not find a speck of envy on this team. Meaning, at least for segment 1, no Rhymeshank, no Chains of Others, no Hexnail, etc., etc. Ironically enough, this was almost a good thing, considering Suncliff's passive will be a non-factor for this segment of the run, but don't worry, part 2 will talk about it. And oh boy, will we talk about it. So instead, Effervescent Corrosion was used on Zweirotian, and while we are at it, here are all of the ego I'm allowed to use on these IDs, with the ones I actually used being highlighted. This also means that Mariachi Sinclair and Chef Gregor were both lost in the transition from Railway 2 to Railway 3, but don't worry, Chef will get his time in the spotlight far later, but still. Mariachi, however, man, despite what the roles may tell you, Zwei Sinclair is genuinely so much worse to use during this challenge, so 07's to Mariachi Sinclair, you were dearly, dearly missed during this run, you will not be seeing him. There's just one last aspect to address, and that's the supportive passives, which were Diechi Sang, En Dawn, LCCB Ryoshu, Liu Hong Lu, Sun Shower Heathcliff, and Rose Spanner Gregor, who were all completely useless during this segment, even if Rose Spanner Gregor could have technically activated with Sloshmill's skill 3 specifically, it never did, and yes, I know I should have used Pirate Gregor, but it just kinda slipped my mind. But now, after just around 19 minutes, thank you for being patient with my preamble, by the way, this was important to cover, I promise, but I need to get into the fights. Unlike Railway 2, where I only recorded Cycle 4, I recorded almost every single attempt of these fights, except when I'm just restarting mindlessly, and hey, I even have some of that. So you get the honor of watching my super slow-ass, carefully Limbus gaming while I talk about the horror of these fights, and at the end of each segment, within the segments, I'll be giving my thoughts on those fights as a whole, since I skipped out on doing that during my guide to Railway 3, so strap in. You still have a lot of video to get through. Welcome to the Scenic Limbus Boat, where the first stop of this challenge awaited me. Now, full transparency here, what you are seeing on screen was technically my second run of this challenge. Since I was actually so worried this challenge would be immediately impossible, I went in with level 35 IDs about 3 days before actually doing the challenge, and attempted both this fight and Siltcurrent, just to get a feel for them and if it would be feasible to complete them at all. So I already had a general idea of what I needed for the Siltcurrent fight, and since there really isn't much to say about the Mermaids besides being a setting up point, it's here that I should talk about one of the more significant rule changes from the Railway 2 video that I've not already mentioned. You may have noticed I didn't specify if grinding/stalling for ego resources was allowed in this challenge, when I explicitly stated it wasn't in Railway 2. Well, that's because that rule was kind of unnecessary in Railway 2 as a whole, considering there were so many fights, but it's also absolutely allowed this time around. Looking at my team, there are definitely some resources that are lacking. Namely, gluttony and lust. I would say envy is lacking too, but it's just not there. So that doesn't really count. Looking at my ego available, both gluttony and lust are used in Lifetime Stew, which will be my only way of healing mid-battle, and gluttony is also needed for Sun Shower Otis, which is a vital ego for Siltcurrent. So really, the hardest part of this fight was stalling enough to where I didn't take too much damage and didn't have to use any ego. All the while, squeezing as much lust out of Otis as okay, you know what, I'm gonna change my phrasing on that. While acquiring as many lust ego resources as possible from Blade Lineage Otis's Skill 2, Acupuncture, which was my only source of lust, and also getting Gluttony from Base Faust and Sloshmill's Skill 3s. So while this was technically my second run, it was still early on in the challenge, and admittedly, while I wasn't overconfident per se, I was excited, I guess, and I was riding the high of having done this challenge in Railway 2. I was confident I knew everything I needed to know about my team, and I thought I would be prepared for what was coming. Since, I spent so much time with a team that was very similar to this one, and while that was partially true, I did know what I was getting into, I also didn't. Past Escu really had no idea just how bad this challenge would get compared to Railway 2. But I still knew one thing, and that was that I was going to do whatever it took to beat this challenge, while still hopefully staying within the confines of my rules, even though I knew that there was a really tricky fight that might bend that, so I grinded for a pretty decent amount of time until I thought I had enough resources for me to get by, and then I moved on to Siltcurrent. But before I do that, I almost forgot. Since you all seem to love him so much in the first videos, the Painometer is making his grand return now, who, as a reminder, is directly linked to my brain cell and can transmit the amount of pain felt during an encounter as a quantifiable number. As a point of reference for this run, a 5 on the Painometer this time is about equal to a 10 on the Painometer last time, meaning Drifting Fox Cycle 3 and Steam Machine would fall at around a 4.5 and a 5, respectively. Yes, that is how much worse this challenge is than Railway 2. Porous and Mermaids, though, come on, like a 1.5, a 2. The only possible issue I could have had was unlucky speed ranges, and frankly, I was so used to that by now that the real issue was being bored with stalling for resources, since yeah, that's just incredibly boring. In terms of the fight itself, fun fact I guess, I think this is the worst fight in Railway 3, as in it shouldn't be in Railway 3. It's not hard. The Mermaids aren't a particularly interesting enemy, and even using the worst team didn't really change my opinion on if they are a fun fight or not, since the answer is a pretty easy and succinct no. If you ask me, this should have just been 519 again, with 4 waves of Mermaids, but maybe that would have just made the problem worse. Regardless, it's a pretty inoffensive filler fight before the actual tough fights begin. To no one's surprise, Node 2 posed a much bigger threat than Node 1 by a factor of about a billion. Looking at all of the fights in Railway 3, before I even attempted it, I had an idea of the potential run enders, all of which are marked on screen now. This is a pretty reasonable list, and I think anybody would come to this conclusion, but looking at Segment 1, having 2 potential run-ending fights back-to-back was really bad, especially early on. Since my health and sanity from the previous fight would carry over to the next, this meant that Siltcurrent, while terrifying on its own, also needed to be beaten with relative to high confidence, and by that I mean a good stock of resources and sanity. This is a scary concept, since a lot of people who do Railway struggle normally on this fight, so what chance did I have using a very not normal team? Well, compared to the average player, it's easy to say that I have no advantages, but I do have one. I can read. It's silly to say, but Making guides on these fights worked to help form a basis for my strategy on how I would take them down using whatever worst team I came up with, and this was before I was even sure I was going to do this challenge. And it meant I was actually forced to know most of the relevant mechanics, since I had to relay them all to you. With that said, there were still some mechanics that would end up surprising me in a lot of the fights, since some only show up under specific circumstances, but I'm getting off track. And the first wave of mermaids in this fight are actually important to talk about, kind of. While it's probably natural to assume that this was the same deal as the porous hand mermaids, it was actually quite different simply because Siltcurrent would be immediately after them. This meant that while I would stall for resources slightly, the most important thing was going into Siltcurrent as topped up on health and sanity as was feasible. And being topped up on health would mean using... And this led to my first documented usage of Lifetime Stew to try and heal during this challenge, and yeah, that's about on brand. A few things to note here: I cannot use Lifetime Stew early on into this wave encounter. The Whale of 1,000 Strand Mermaids only have 124 max HP, and there are 6 of them, meaning even at full health, they have the least HP on the field, and my 7 attack weights meant I could only heal one of my allies if all 6 of them were alive. I was slightly more bruised and battered from the porous hand mermaids than I really should have accepted at the time, but it was early on, and I absolutely felt I needed to use one Lifetime Stew before meeting the big fish because of this semi-blunder. The plan was to use Lifetime Stew when there was only 1 or 2 mermaids left, hit heads, and then have one of my allies kill the mermaids after Sinclair has fired off soup. 1,000 Strand Mermaids are level 40, and would normally give sanity on kill, so killing them with soup would be ideal because that's 10 sanity, but they actually canceled that out by reducing sanity by 10 to the enemy that hit them last, so I needed to take advantage of the sanity spread that higher level enemies gave to the whole team once they died. This was a smaller bonus of only 5 sanity, which wouldn't fully refund the 15 from using Lifetime Stew, but Zwei Sinclair's sanity and health are of the utmost priority, so any amount I can take, I would get. His health is not renewable, and his sanity directly ties into how reliable my renewable health on any other ID is. I know that is overly complicated for just the mermaids, but it's honestly part of what made this challenge fun. Having to optimize all of these small benefits that most players would never have the displeasure of having to worry about, it's a special kind of satisfaction. But now, Siltcurrent. I shouldn't have to explain the slew of problems this fight poses, but I'll briefly talk about them in case you haven't fought this guy yet or don't play the game. Stupid dumb cool whale guy will set up his LED light show on turn 1 of the encounter. The LED lights are so bright that they inflict paralyze to all of my IDs, making their coins unable to have coin power based on the count, so their rolls are even more crippled than they are by default. On that same turn, he's also going to use Blind Obsession, which is a very fair and balanced skill for me to try and clash against. And by that, I mean I literally only have one option that works consistently, and that is Sunshower Otis, since it has a floor of 26. It can outroll Blind Obsession and deal some pretty decent damage too, except, well, that LED light show he puts on also trips me up in the wires and inflicts me with 1 bind. This is problematic. If you remember from the Railway 2 run, I learned about halfway through that bind is super useful for my slow-ass team, since even if I roll a 2, which is the lowest possible natural roll of speed an ID can have, it doesn't matter, so long as the enemy is rolling a 1. I would always use one of my 2 Ishmael Ego to inflict bind onto Siltcurrent the previous turn to make sure he is rolling a 1 with a skill slot using Blind Obsession. Roseate Desire was strongly preferred due to its passive, but I'll talk more about that ego on the next fight. The issue was, even if the enemy had 1 speed, that didn't matter if I also had 1 speed. This meant my tried and true strategy of binding every big enemy I see wasn't consistent on this fight, which really hurt. This meant I had to use my backup option, and thank God Zwyrodian actually rolled decently on her speed on the successful attempt, since Effervescent Corrosion was my backup in case something went wrong. Though its floor is far lower than Sunshower Otis's, it can work with a little bit of RNG, which I ended up just barely getting on this attempt. Effervescent Corrosion is also responsible for the massive amount of tremor count on Siltcurrent, which was neat, and it also worked to convert 2 Sloth, Gloom, and Pride, resources I had an abundance of, and turn it into a Gluttony, a resource I severely lacked. During segment 1, I would use this ego a lot since Gluttony was so scarce, and it felt pretty good to actually take advantage of this pretty unique ego quirk. Effervescent Corrosion was also great since it was the best AoE option I would get, outside of Lifetime Stew, which using that for damage would be downright idiotic. Effervescent Corrosion gains more attack weight when the enemy has X plus health percentage. For these big abnormalities, I would often have a 4 attack weight skill, and this helped to deal damage to the Flotsam. Breaking a Flotsam as often as possible was critical, since if a Flotsam was not broken, Blind Obsession would be used against me again the next turn, which was just an X factor I did not want to deal with. Now, the first of many mechanics I forgot existed about fights that actually came up and were relevant for my team. How many of you remembered that Flotsam don't take damage from attacks that deal less than 12 damage? Look, my attacks were already pitiful by default, but with Siltcurrent lowering my sanity via sinking, and the 1 paralyzed meaning my first coins were worthless, breaking Flotsams became a heavy commitment. Usually requiring maybe a single attack from a good ID, took multiple hits from my team. Or precious resources spent on my few AoE ego. Since Representation Emitter took Gluttony, Effervescent Corrosion was by far my best option to hit the Flotsam with, and it clashed pretty well. Also, that tremor you see on Siltcurrent's body and fluorescence, that's not just for show. That mattered. Looking at my team at a glance, there is no clear through line, except for tremor. Now, back in Railway 2, I lamented over how I could not use Tremor, due to Sloshmill's skill 3 reducing count by a million, I don't know, I can't remember. Except now, Effervescent Corrosion Rodian actually just barely counteracts the damage done by Sloshmill, and Zwei Sinclair does have a respectable amount of potency on that skill 2, even if I lose the Clash, alongside Merceau's easy access to a free Tremor Burst on the skill 2. This meant that once I got into a rhythm of breaking Flotsam and taking, admittedly, risky clashes due to lowered sanity, I eventually got his Fluorescence to break, which breaks the fight wide open. Since it inflicts a paralyze onto him instead of me, gets rid of that pesky 1 bind, and gives me poise, which was actually quite nice for Zwei Rodian, and I guess Biolotus too, I forgot she was there. Siltcurrent having a self-inflicted paralyze is particularly important, since it allowed some of my worst clashers, or worst clashing skills, to win things they really shouldn't, and regaining sanity became possible due to this, which was going to be necessary for Gossypium. Overall, weirdly, this fight wasn't too bad. A lot of people seem to think that this would be the first major roadblock, if not the end of the run, and they had no way of knowing I would be using Zayn and Teth Ego only. Maybe some of it is that I like the Siltcurrent fight quite a bit, and I'm glad he's in Railway. But he actually ends up feeling pretty forgettable, and I think that's due to his shockingly low health and no damage type resistance, meaning once you know how to play around the gimmick, Siltcurrent is pretty quickly staggered and dealt with, even with an absolutely abhorrent team using not all of the possible ego. Also, just like in Railway 2, I'll be saying which ID/ego was the MVP for a given fight here, and it's hard to say. But I think I will go with Effervescent Corrosion, just for being incredibly clutch for me on the winning attempt, and just being a really good ego despite people overlooking it because, okay, well, I don't blame them for overlooking it, but it is still a good ego. Siltcurrent took about an hour and a half of attempts before I took it down, and sits at a pretty low 3.5 out of 10 on the painometer. It's a stressful fight for sure, since one wrong move and your sanity can tank due to sinking, or your health can tank due to dying, but eventually I shit-talked the whale. Easy, boss. Got my ass beat for it a little bit, I probably deserved that, and then was able to move on to Gossypium. Hey, since you made it so far into this video, thanks. Seriously, this challenge took a lot of time, and watching to this point means I'm getting a good ROI, and while I usually try to veil my calls to action to subscribe behind bits, this time I have earned a genuine shill. So, subscribe, like the video, do whatever, and if you don't believe I have earned that bold of a plug, welcome to Drenched Gossypium. Now, I know there's not really any suspense on whether I beat these fights or not, so you are aware I got past this. But how long do you think this fight took? No, not turn count. Hours, wise. I'll let you stew in that question while I talk about every delightful little factor that made this fight miserable. First of all, I only have 2 evade IDs to possibly deal with Gossypium's unclashable attacks. Now, the actual damage these deal aren't really the problem, and tanking some of them near the beginning of the fight is okay, but unoptimal, of course. The issue is that these can heal Drenched Gossypium based on the amount of Gossypium debuff I have on me. It doesn't help that Gossypium heals based on the amount of bleed on me too, so if I have bleed stacked up, that's just even more healing. For the first couple of turns, though, this fight is actually completely fine-ish. It's not like Gossypium actually clashes all that high for now. Now, look, bleed is a problem for any team, since damage is bad no matter how you slice it. But a few of my IDs have a very bad and semi-unique problem when it comes to bleed. Specifically, Sinclair, Sloshmill, Lotus, and Base Faust. All of these IDs have a single coin skill 1 and a low amount of coins overall. Since bleed ticks whenever a coin is tossed in combat or a clash occurs, I would actually not be able to tick bleed enough on these IDs to shake it off while it was at a manageable potency. Instead, it would somewhat unavoidably just compound on itself, meaning that theoretically, instead of taking 3 instances of 3 bleed damage, I would take 2 of those instances of damage, and then my bleed potency and count would increase before I could reduce it further. This was exacerbated by the fact that I had to use Ego, which are all single coin skills, so I was just never getting the bleed off of me. This meant that, predictably, Drenched Gossypium put me on a timer. And even worse, those easy clashes it provided weren't the case anymore when in the red stained state, since it gained clash power based on the amount of Gossypium I had on me. Now, this would be okay, if it weren't for the fact that it is super not okay. Just like Siltcurrent, Gossypium thinks it's a fun idea to take after the first boss in the game and inflict 1 bind to my whole team, or everyone that has Gossypiums, once again. I imagine almost no one noticed this while fighting Gossypium, and I certainly didn't notice it during my first 2 clears of Railway 2, and also once again, this caused some serious issues, especially with the unclashable attacks since I could oftentimes just do nothing. Even worse, when I could do something, I had to sacrifice damage to be evading with Lotus, or Base Faust, or even guarding just to save HP. I still believe this was ultimately productive, since the health Gossypium could siphon from me could end up getting to a scary level, especially so considering 14 of my 18 skills were blunt, and not out-damaging Gossypium's healing, with my regular skills at least, was a very real problem. Speaking of problems, we aren't done talking about them, not even close. This is more of a universal problem, and believe it or not, it is actually the least problematic in this segment, but aggro. Aggro was an unexpected twist villain in my last run, making some fights way less consistent than they should have been, and luckily this time I have 3 IDs with aggro, allowing some kind of split between them, except Sinclair. Look, for some reason they decided to give Sinclair 10 aggro on his skill 3, and the worst part is, that is his only usable skill for clashing, meaning ignoring it was stupid on several levels, so it had to be used. If Sloshmill and Zwyrodian were using Ego, or Zwyrodian was using her skill 3, which does not give her aggro, and Sinclair used his skill 3, it's not unfair to say that in any battle, almost every single skill slot would then target him. So what are Sinclair's options for clashing against these attacks? Well, I already established Soup is off the table, and his skill 1 and skill 2 suck ass unless you're losing with the skill 1, so if the skill 3 was out of rotation, which it would be if that many attacks were targeting him, there is exactly one option to try and win clashes. Branch of Knowledge. Lucky me, Branch of Knowledge clashes very high, at a 29 on heads hit, and a still usable 14 on tails hit. The issues were threefold, however. Number 1, this costs 3 Gluttony, a bottleneck resource for me. 2, this costs 20 SP on heads hit. Need I remind you, every single base ego in the game that is single target only costs 10 SP to use. And even the AoE ones restore SP after their usage. Branch of Knowledge tries to lean into Sinclair's lore of being unstable, and instead becomes another one of the main villains of this run, since it was a trump card I was often forced into playing. my only other option being eating the damage on the one ID that cannot receive healing from any source. Guard would help sometimes, but not here, since eating hits meant more bleed, and more healing, and more bleed meant I can't attack anymore once there's a certain amount of bleed on me, since I'll just bleed out and die. And about that Sandy lost in Branch of Knowledge, need I remind you that Lifetime Stew's healing is reliant on me hitting heads. Every time I would roll Branch of Knowledge to attack with, I was crossing my fingers for a Tails hit, since that would give me back the SP and actually end up costing 0, which would be great. But I believe I only ever saw him hit Tails 4 times total, and there's only 2 times I can think of that it actually ever mattered. And 3. Yeah, I bet you forgot there was a third problem. This passive. Now, funny thing, my low amount of coins means that this is actually not that intrusive, since the only skill that can roll a different result on 2 coins is his skill 2. But I wish I was kidding when I say that losing 5 SP could sometimes be semi-permanent, since regaining sanity not through representation emitter was unlikely at best. And hey, more problems, since I haven't even talked about Gossypium's scary attacks that it just has. Nothing like Blind Obsession, of course, but still decently high-rolling mass attacks that gain base power on the target with the highest bleed sounds not great. But it gets worse when you realize it's entirely possible for me to be unable to redirect that attack onto an ID without the highest bleed if I just got unlucky enough. This was a pretty low chance, thankfully, but it definitely happened at least once. While I'm on a roll, let's talk about Merceau, since he had a pretty unfortunate debuff. Keen viewers may have noticed that he can't use Ego during this segment. Both of my options require Envy, meaning if Merceau is targeted by an attack and he didn't have his skill 2, he was eating that attack. What's worse is his base Ego's resistances are fatal to Lust, and fatal to Gluttony, and he's fatal to Pierce. Yeah. Not great. Okay. That's finally the end of the long list of problems Gossypium posed, for now at least, since I want to talk about my strategy. This was the fight I quit out of on my first scouting run, since it didn't go well. At all. Gossypium is about endurance, and while my IDs are generally on the tanky side, that doesn't matter when my total health pool can be depleted far quicker than Gossypium's. My initial strategy revolved around minimizing speed RNG, and I had a new ego to play around with that I had previously forgotten about, and boy was I stupid to do that. Roseate Desire, Ishmael. A lot of people overlook this ego, and while I do think it does a slightly worse job of being a debuffing ego than chains of others due to being speed reliant, on a team where Sloshmill was almost always going first, Roseate Desire is brilliant. 3 Paralyze, 10 offense level down, and some bind next turn. This basically crippled the enemy's clash power by 3 for a turn, and 3 Paralyze made it even safer. The issue was that this was heavy on Lust, and as I'm sure you've seen, I am severely lacking in that resource, since, as a reminder, I literally had no other way to get it besides Otis's skill 2. However, the passive made it more than worth it. After using Roseate Desire once, for the rest of the battle, whenever Sloshmill won a clash, she inflicted Pink Ribbons, which are a unique debuff whose count increases every time the enemy rolls a coin or clashes. Then Bind is inflicted next turn equal to the number. This could not be more perfect, and meant that Gossypium was, for all intents and purposes, permanently stuck at 1 speed for the entire fight. Once again, though, I couldn't play around my own speed reduction via the 1 bind. So this did help a lot, but I was still struggling to speed ranges. After quite a few attempts of not really having a plan and not getting very far as a result, I finally fully recognized the MVP of this fight. My damage was pathetic, and I only got 1 chance during the entire fight to remove the Gossypiums from my IDs via a check that happened around turn 4, which was far too early to really matter. So I was going to be in the fight for far too long and just die out if I couldn't find a way to deal more damage. Then it hit me. I couldn't deal more damage. Not directly, at least. Tremor was the only way. I needed to get to Gossypium's stagger bar as quickly as possible to allow me a turn to recover from its onslaught, and ideally I could manipulate its health, so I essentially got 2 turns of stagger. For those who don't know how stagger works, stagger occurs for both the turn you actually make the enemy go under the stagger threshold and then the turn after that. This means that if you stagger the enemy with the last attack in the chain, you actually lose out on quite a lot of damage. It was hard to do, but I would try to make it so my enemies would cross stagger thresholds at the start of turns when possible. This would cancel out all of their attacks while allowing me to deal fatal damage for longer. This was crucial due to how I picked the worst IDs with the worst damage type matchups. Sin Affinities would still be resisted, but fatal damage was so useful to making this work. Getting me closer to that stagger threshold faster is the reason why Tremor was so helpful, and Effervescent Corrosion really showed me how good it could be, since it meant I didn't have to worry about maintaining Tremor count while generating Gluttony and bursting Tremor. This also meant that having Snag Harpoon Thread Spun to 4 actually mattered, which just blew my mind. And when I say mattered, I mean it was my main way of bursting Tremor, so it really mattered. So with this idea in place, here was the strategy for Drenched Gossypium. I would reset until I got a good Tremor turn, as I would call it, and decent targeting luck. It didn't have to be perfect, but evading one of the unclashables was enough for me to let the run go. Roseate Desire or Snag Harpoon is always used turn 1, with a strong preference for Roseate Desire, but getting Snag Harpoon's passive up was also always a priority in every fight with Sloshmill. Effervescent Corrosion was almost always used by Rodian, even though what is cast was my best damaging option. Guaranteeing Tremor count safety on turn start was just correct. Then the other IDs had less important jobs, but Optimal Luck would see Zweissinclair winning a clash with his skill 2. Yeah, right. Optimal Luck saw Zweissinclair going unopposed with his skill 2, or I even grew to accept losing a clash with it just to get that 6 Tremor applied. Yes, seriously, this is real. It's not a joke. Then, ideally, Merceau would use his skill 1 or 3, since his skill 2 was a reliable clashing tool, and a free Tremor burst, which I wanted for later since Tremor was higher. This is another reason why not using Zweissinclair's skill 3 just wasn't a good idea, since it was a free Tremor burst. BL Otis and Base Faust were basically there to evade, but BL Otis could deal decent damage with her skill 3 after Tepathos Mathos has scaled its ego passive enough to give 3 damage up. From there, the fight would progress as normally as it could, considering I'm using the worst team, until after the Gossypiums have been cleared off of my team via the abnormality check. Now, after this point, I had to do the dreaded thing. I needed to find an opportunity to use Lifetime Stew. This served 2 functions. 1, healing, at least hopefully, and 2, this would change my resistances to no longer be Wrath Fatal and to instead be Lust Resistant. This was a huge upgrade for Zweissinclair's tanking capability, and since his damage was pathetic and this was the last node of the segment, it became clear that eventually he would be relegated to mostly playing defense. Even if that often meant healing Gossypium, it was kind of the only thing he could do. And since I mentioned Lifetime Stew, it's time for a Stew segment, where I want to talk about its specific method of healing, which is just the worst thing ever. This specifically hits allies. Now that doesn't sound problematic since it's for 0 damage, but let's suppose you were in a fight against an abnormality that inflicted a lot of bleed, which is a status that doesn't stagger you if it brings you below the stagger threshold via damage from it. Getting hit by Lifetime Stew while below your stagger threshold and not staggered staggers you. Now, you cannot be in a staggered state during Drenched Gossypium's fight, but this meant more bleed and attack power down. All because I tried to heal my team. Even worse if I hit Tails, since the 7 burn absolutely can stagger allies when it ticks, and that's why it was almost always a reset whenever I hit Tails on Lifetime Stew. Also, as a side note, remember when I said this ego heals by 10% of the user's max HP? Well, you may have noticed during this footage that it actually only ever heals 20 HP instead of 21. Why? I don't fucking know, this ego sucks, that's why. Now that I've gotten out about 10% of my anger towards that ego, let's talk about the hard part of this fight, since Gossypium has a desperate phase, as I'll call it. This is a phase that occurs when the abnormality drops below a certain amount of core HP, and usually leads to bad things happening during it. In this instance, Gossypium will always be red-stained and always use the big scary mass attacks. This was also known as the Gossypium better be really low on health or close to a stagger threshold or you are screwed phase, since that's really what it came down to. it is unreasonable to expect the speed ranges to favor you. And at this point in the fight, it is possible for several IDs to be dead, which was acceptable but led to problems like sandy loss and the fact that they can no longer clash on account of being dead. However, finally, after just around 4 hours of fighting Gossypium, I think this is it. Please just do it. No! No. Oh, I should just gone unopposed. I lost to Gossypium. The reason why? Well, I clashed using the ID with the most bleed on one of the scary mass attacks. It was just entirely my own fault, which made it so much worse. I'll be honest when I say that this was a low point for the challenge on the whole. And there are fittingly 3 points where I felt really, really bad during this entire run. This loss hurt. It was so bad that I named the video file Gossypium Devastating Loss, and this screenshot haunts my nightmares. Also, yes, you see that correctly, 91 Tremor. I was committed to Tremor strats, and they paid off. After another hour of attempts to Gossypium, about 5.5 hours after reaching this node. I hated this. This was miserable. But now, it should be over. Oh my god, my resources are so sapped. No. Okay. New team time. We're moving on. God, this fight. Just reset after reset after reset after reset after reset. This took about 5 hours and some odd minutes. This was not fun. I've just been spacing out the whole time, and wait, that's not good. Wait, that's so bad. Wait. Please, just let it be over. Please. I can't take this. Wow, wait, really? Oh my god, that's... But that should win. And that kills. There is no universe in which that does not do 19 damage. Oh my god. Please. Oh my god, it's over. Oh, that's it. Oh my god. I hope I was able to explain in voiceover how painful that was, but it's over. Now time for segment 2. As me from the past mentioned, I hope you get a sense of how miserable this fight was by watching footage and listening to my war stories. Between slowly bleeding to death and even just the natural pains of Limbus like missing coins, it all added up to be a pretty mind-numbingly painful fight, especially all in about one sitting, which is what I did. But looking back, and despite my anger, I actually had fun here. Once the fight properly started. Drenched Gossypium is still probably my favorite fight in Railway, since its design is so unique, despite the pain it caused me, but it was at least an engaging hell. And spoilers, Drenched Gossypium is the lowest turn count I got on a Railway fight. No other fight here was done in 13 turns or less, and it makes sense. Gossypium encourages you to be hyper-aggressive, while also punishing you slightly for not dodging its attacks. I had to find the right balance on this fight, and while resetting at the beginning of the fight over and over again for the right skills and targeting was a bore, past turn 4 I was genuinely engaged with the fight, stressed out of my mind, yes, but also engaged and enjoying the fight as best I could while still trying to play well. For MVP, it has to be Roseate Desire. The consistent bind and access to debuffing, even if it was a steep cost, was just so good. I know Tremor was the main star of the show, but I cannot stress enough how good consistent bind is. On the painometer, Drenched Gossypium is no slouch. It made me want to quit at one point, but only at one point. So this gets a solid 8 out of 10, since 5.5 hours is one of the longer real-life amounts of time invested into one of these railway fights, and blows every fight in Railway 2 out of the water. As a reminder, the fight that took the longest in Railway 2 was Cycle 3 Fox, at a measly 3 hours. We are 3 fights in, and Gossypium already clears that very comfortably in terms of pain. And that's the end of segment 1, which is generally considered the easiest of the segments, and spoilers, yeah, it kinda was. And even this, the easiest of the segments, had one of the harder fights overall with Drenched Gossypium. And yet, we all know that this is just the beginning. And this is merely the first of my 4 teams for the challenge. For those curious, by the end of segment 1, my turn count was 55, and my rough estimate of hours invested would be around 8.5, with Gossypium taking up a huge majority of that playtime. There's still so much more I need to show you all and talk about, but it simply cannot all fit into one video. Seriously, oh my god, this is an hour long. So, how did I beat Ambling Pearl, Skin Prophet, and the infamous Ardor Blossom Moth? You'll just have to wait for the second part of this 3-part saga. Seriously, this part was meant to be like 30 minutes and cover up to Skin Prophet, but that clearly didn't work out. So, I'm going back to the editing mines and working on that video, but as always, thank you for watching. And I hope to see you again soon, but for the time being, this video ends now.